but I thought I would today prepare a few remarks on what I call reflections on crisis and reputation. And self-evidently for us, the two are hand in hand. The first half of what I'm going to say, forgive me, may risk to sound very prosaic because it kind of just recalls a number of things that I don't develop with statistical flourishes and so on, but which I think are essentially indisputable. Because I think we need to know with regard to this crisis to have some level of consensus, including for dealing with non-Irish people about the crisis. What is the essence of the crisis? Where did it go wrong? So a little bit is that, and a little bit is looking forward. We joined the euro from the outset in 1999. Joining the euro meant we would suffer a loss of national sovereignty, to the extent that we had such, over exchange rate and interest rate policy inside the eurozone, and this was matched by a commensurate need to exercise greater national vigilance over fiscal and incomes policy, which still remained within our control. And these things were at least intellectually clear at the beginning. You lose some instruments, you have some other instruments, and the requirement to exercise vigilance on the other instruments becomes commensurate with the scale of the new challenge. To skip through it most of a decade, but I think not to do it an injustice, in an act of strategic illiteracy, fiscal and incomes policies perversely became doubly incontinent throughout the years after 2000 until the onset of recession in 2008. This destroyed Ireland's competitive position, for which loads of sums and details for those who would like them. Access to an unlimited quantity of liquidity at low interest rates with no exchange risk was also added in this period and was used, as we know, increasingly to finance the unsustainable and ultimately unproductive property boom and a consumer credit boom. Our constant loss of competitiveness from 2000 onwards was masked from our attention by our burgeoning property and consumer boom. So even as the competitiveness went south and the level of export growth started to go south, it was masked because of the still pumping economy to do with property and consumer boom. Property, as we know, at the peak was more than 20% of GDP and accounted for more than 1 in 6 at work and accounted for an unusually large slice of exchequer revenue. Ireland today is enduring the consequences after the property bubble collapsed or exploded. We're enduring the consequences of one of the sharpest, fastest, deepest, and unhappily longest recessions ever experienced by any state in the OECD. So we're in a uniquely difficult place if we do the statistical comparisons. When the property bubble exploded, it left a trail of value destruction and economic breakdown in its wake, creating the perfect economic storm of unprecedented fiscal deficits, failed banks, and an eventual liquidity lockout by the markets. Through our state-backed guarantees, that was going back to the famous night in September 2008, the debts of Ireland banking collapse were socialised. These debts have added to historically high underlying fiscal deficits as exchequer property-related tax revenue disappeared overnight without commensurate reductions in public expenditure and as the effects of the recession triggered automatic stabilisers. The proposition was made and argued by some in authority that this level of debt was manageable, but that argument has proved illusory, laid bare by the aggressive bond spreads on Irish debt, the flight of deposits from Irish banks, and the inability of these institutions some months ago to roll over maturing debt without recourse to the lenders of last resort, the European Central Bank, and when it ran out of patience, even the Irish Central Bank. Even when these facts became apparent, the Irish governmental elite remained in denial about the extent of our margin of manoeuvre, that in effect we had run out of road. For the first time since independence, we've been obliged to seek a bailout from the EU and IMF, which for the immediate future guarantees access to sufficient finance to pay our way, at the cost, of course, of strict conditionality and relatively high interest rates, but much lower, of course, than those that would currently prevail if the bond markets were open to us, which they're not. That background I present simply as a quick tour d'horizon, that if there's a core problem, the essence of the problem is to be found more at home than abroad. There's no doubt that the liquidity tsunami at low interest rate and no exchange risk was something that across the sum of the authorities, whether European or Irish, got, as we know, inadequate supervision, but the underlying loss of competitiveness and the conversion of the tsunami into unproductive investment were choices made by Irish economic agents in the context of the flood of available credit. Public opinion is now traumatised. People are angry, disillusioned and wounded, resulting in a deep loss of confidence in our political institutions and, for the moment, in our economic prospects. I think we have all of the preconditions for an outbreak of political populism. Populism, for myself, to define the term as I choose to use it in this remark, has a standard modus operandi. It first recognises available fears and anxieties. Then it plays on fear and anxiety by exaggerating it. It usually proposes superficially attractive but ultimately simplistic solutions to complex problems, and populism normally searches to scapegoat by externalising blame. In France, Mr. Le Pen, blame migrants, blame Europe, whatever. We've had the movement in Sweden, which was an anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant. We've something similar with Geert Wilders in Netherlands and so on. I'm not suggesting that imminently we're necessarily going to have an Irish Geert Wilders, although who knows what's imminent. We have some interesting weeks to come. But I certainly think this is ripe ground also for the likes of Sinn Féin to step up with some pretty populist left-of-centre logic and rhetoric, which will include externalising some or all of the blame, apart from whatever they want to do vis-à-vis Fianna Fáil, and which will probably include some pretty attractive but superficial solutions. A discourse which would seek to shift the blame to foreigners, the EU, the ECB, the IMF, the Germans, risks to dilute the necessity for fundamental institutional, administrative and political reform at home. After all, if you're going to blame foreigners, then you don't have necessarily too much to sort out in your own system. It also lacks, and for me this is more important, any international anchor or framework within which to postulate viable and sustainable policy solutions. As regards anchors, unhappily for Ireland at this time, the EU itself is struggling to come to terms with the wider Eurozone crisis, triggered by its troubled periphery, but a crisis not confined to that periphery. The Greek and Irish bailouts and the establishment of the financial stability mechanism have bought time, but in themselves do not constitute a sufficient solution. The Union today or tomorrow is on the threshold of agreeing the wording for a light-touch, intergovernmental-oriented treaty revision that, if ratified, should satisfy Germany's constitutional needs, but not likely those of the financial markets. Economic governance, the E part of EMU, needs to be broadened and deepened. The Stability and Growth Pact emphasis on Maastricht borrowing and debt criteria has been honoured in the past more in the breach than in the observance, including by Germany itself, but the challenge is broader. Long-term divergence in the underlying competitiveness of member states within the Eurozone has emerged as a fundamental weakness, while financial market concerns about sovereign default is unmatched by the scale of potential bailout funds. A German-led suggestion of medium-term debt restructuring to avoid the entire burden of adjustment falling on taxpayers has accentuated both short-term market pressure on the Eurozone's periphery and has accentuated the sense of crisis, despite what I would regard as its ultimately commendable underlying rationale. In terms of anchoring our future, Ireland has a vital national interest in the EU coming to grips with the challenge and not simply muddling through, although muddling through, as we know, is one of the particular art forms more practiced in Europe than in some other places. I would suggest here in this institute and with this kind of group that we need in Ireland in the coming weeks and months to rediscover what I would call our EU centre of gravity, to find our voice, to friend raise, and to promote common cause in finding a solution sufficient to the scale of the challenge. The periphery burning while the centre fiddles serves the long-term interests of neither. Europe's political elites have to rise above national egoism. Ireland can and should play a positive role in helping to create a climate for change, and in doing so help to alleviate some of the most onerous conditions with which we find ourselves now burdened. The solution for Ireland, I think, will not be found in a misplaced nostalgia for a go-it-alone isolationism, nor in some kind of utopianism about becoming the United States' 51st state, nor is a national whinge a substitute for a realistic and well-calibrated strategy. Faced with the rigorous challenges of globalisation, do its proponents seriously believe that Ireland lapsing into a second-tier Eurozone division, if some such ever came, is a pathway to 21st century world-beating success? We need in Ireland to construct a narrative relevant to our needs, but not confined to our narrow interests alone. As regards dissuasion, dissuasive interest rates in particular, which we've been talking about in the past 24 hours, that narrative can develop a number of themes. It's clear, for example, that Europe's 20th century has lived with the consequences of the economic logic of the reparation payments of the Treaty of Versailles, and also with the economic logic of the bounty of the Marshall Plan. None would question which logic proved the more compelling and endurable. Equally, the instability of the Weimar Republic after World War I has indelibly marked the German experience and finds its contemporary expression in a need to accept strict policy conditionality as the counterpart of a weightier engagement by this, the EU's indispensable player. Ireland's international reputation has suffered grievously in the past several years. It matters not simply because of what others think of us, but rather because, though intangible, it is a prime national asset. As regards reputation, it is time to get our thinking straight, to start believing that we can and shall overcome our difficulties, and to invest some time and energy in restoring this vital national asset. Nothing short of what, to play with words, I might call a reputational NAMA, a national asset management activism. Thank you.